In Cape Town, especially with our at-risk communities, there's a lot of youth that's unemployed.
Well, if I wouldn't have been here, I would be probably wasting my time doing bad things.
Coming to work, having to listen to each and every child's story and support, I got to realize that I'm not only a mom at home, but I'm a mom to a nation.
I lost my mother when I was like 5, but then when I met Miss Shireen, she was like a mother to me. Miss Shireen told me that, you are a beautiful girl and you're intelligent and smart.
They try their utmost best to make you succeed in life.
What I wanted in life and what the teacher is learning me is skills, and what they're doing in the school is what I love.
Our Learn to Live School of Skills is the only special school of skills in South Africa.
After the 4-year program, the kids are able to come back. We still offer them assistance in terms of drafting up their CVs for them, finding them a job.
And place them once they've been trained here at the Salesian Institute. There's so many opportunities where the guys can go to.
So we've been around for 100 years, and we obviously are a sustainable organization. We have longevity. But with the economic times around us, there's always challenges.
I can only teach them what I can with what I've got.
We as the Institute, we were hoping that we would be able to equip them and give them their little bag with their equipment at the end of the year.
Our hopes for this institution is to roll out new programs in the near future based on 21st century educational principles, so that we can target not only youth from 13 to 18, but also the youth from 18 to 24 who is not in employment and further education. We've got some phenomenal, innovative programs that we want to roll out soon, and we do need funding for that.
Céad míle fáilte. They're the first words you'll see when you enter Ireland. 100,000 welcomes. And that's what I would like to start this presentation with, is 100,000 welcomes to all of you who are watching today. I've taken the time to see the work that we do here. My name is Pádraig. I am the CEO of a registered NGO here in Cape Town on the southern tip of South Africa. It's called Salesian Institute Youth Projects. But Salesian Institute Youth Projects is a mouthful, so we'll shorten it to SIYP. I'm a Salesian, and Don Bosco had exactly the same problems when he was working with kids in Turin. There were people there who just needed his help. And he came to the conclusion that education is the key. It's the key to unlocking their future. He wasn't talking just about lectures and skills even. He was talking about a holistic approach to education. And he had 3 big pillars on which he built his system. First one was reason, that we would reason with the young people, listen to them, talk to them, but they needed to know that they were heard. The second one was principles of faith. That would be very much part of the holistic approach that he had. And the third one was a very important one that we sometimes tend to forget, and that is loving kindness. We had to make sure that we loved those young people that we're working with. It's very easy for people to say, I love you. But Don Bosco said, that's not the point. The point is Do the young people know that they're loved? And that's the test. If they know that they're loved, of course they will trust us. Of course they will listen. Of course we can educate them. Because the youth we have been rejected. They are youth at risk, marginalized youth. That's a word we use quite often, but we need to know that these young people are born into poverty. They're born into communities full of gangs. They're born into communities rife with drugs and abuse. What a start to their life, and how difficult it is to rise from that start. Most parents and teachers, they love to see the young people getting capped and gowned. It's a great moment of joy. But we will never see that with most of our kids. Because of the grim start that they had, they won't get capped and gowned. Most parents love to see their children getting work and moving up the ladder and getting to the top. We won't see that. They won't have the luxury of a choice of work. To get any work, it's a great achievement. And so that's what we work with. And that's why we create a brighter future for these young people by creating opportunities for them. Yes, we set that ethos here at Salesian Institute, welcoming the youth, loving them, respecting them. We teach them through play, training, discussions, and performance. Yes, we make the ethos possible. But for a long time, I've been worried, and sharing it with other people, that we're trying to teach these young people through the classroom-based education, the traditional methods. What we have to realize, and we do realize, that's failed them. They've dropped out of that kind of education a long time ago. So the chances of coming back to normal society using that type of education is virtually nil. And I was struggling with that for a long time. And then Professor Tom Ryan came into our lives. He is an educationalist specialist, and he believes in the student-centered approach to education, where they meet ordinary problems and they explore in a dynamic and a collaborative way, and they come up with solutions. It fits in so well with our vision, with Don Bosco's vision. And as soon as I heard about it, I was very convinced that project-based education is the answer that I was looking for and that we were looking for. Tom is going to share that with us a little bit later. But I want to tell you that through his hard work, through his brilliant vision, the Learn to Live School of Skills has already turned around dramatically. We have about 230 young people come to our school. They've been transformed. Their lives have been transformed. And we will go into a little bit more detail about that as well. Gabriel, my colleague, will show you what the day looks like, what it looks like to have them working. Oh no, we had a lot of skepticism at the beginning. Very few people really believed that we could do this. Very few people believed that it would work. And it took a lot of convincing. Our teachers were very skeptical. They know our kids, And as you know, teachers are trained in a special way, in a way that to teach, they know that they're taught that, and to ask them to come around to a new way of doing it through project learning, they were very skeptical. But fair play to them. They accepted, and they accepted the training that we gave them, because that was absolutely essential. They accepted the training, probably still skeptical, and then they accepted to try it out with the young people. They were amazed. They were amazed at the difference it made to the young people. When they saw that, they embraced it. The first thing that happened is that discipline in the classroom improved measurably. Learning was taking place, and it was taking place in joyful ethos. And that's what we want to share with the whole world today. I'm so pleased that Dr. Ria de Villiers is joining us, because she comes from the Department of Basic Education through eCubed, and that's a dynamic organization in the field of project-based education and training here in South Africa. She knows what Tom is doing. They work together, and they will both present to you. Following their presentations, my colleague Gabriel, who's the project manager in Learn to Live, will share what it's like to work with the kids on the ground using project-based education. Ria, I'd like you to do your presentation now, and I hand over to you, and thank you very much for being present.
Thank you, Father Pat, and it's thrilling to be part of World Education Week as a representative of eCubed. Thank you, Father Pat. It's thrilling to be part of World Education Week as a member of eCubed, a program within the Department of Basic Education in South Africa, where the government in the country has decided to institutionalize project-based learning. So I'm going to be presenting the plan of the Department of Basic Education. We have a long-term vision, and eventually we shall be implementing project-based learning across the board. The world is changing, we know this, and the National Department of Basic Education in South Africa see eCubed and project-based learning as a solution, because through project-based learning, every learner in this country who has spent 13 years at school will have an option, either entrepreneurship, employability, or education for lifelong learning. And the world is changing, and the reasons for project-based learning are very clear to us. Youth unemployment is a huge issue in South African education. And if you look at the graph, compare Southern Africa with the rest of Africa and compare Southern Africa with the world. It's a very, very black picture. And of course, we've also had in South Africa the dubious distinction of being on the front cover of the Time magazine as the world's most unequal country. And when we look at the statistics, it's horrifying. Something has to happen in South African education. Coupled with this is the fourth industrial revolution, and the world that the learners are going to be entering has changed dramatically. We have disruptive technologies, the Internet of Things, virtual reality, but not only this, the speed of change is exponential, with many, many more job choices for learners once they leave school. And maybe the Salesians can have a look here. Perhaps you'd like to create a new program around some of these jobs. Then, of course, we have COVID-19 and the new normal. And according to the World Economic Forum, a ticking time bomb in terms of youth unemployment. And the World Health Organization has warned that our continent, Africa, may become the next epicenter of the virus. So globally, the picture doesn't look good for learners who are leaving school within the next couple of years. Pandemics, climate change, conflict, there's so much they have to face, and it's becoming more and more clear that education at school level has become critical, and we as educators cannot allow one moment of that learner's school life to be wasted. Every second of the 13 years has to be used fruitfully. And so the National Department of Basic Education in South Africa started in 2011 with research projects. It was required by Mr. Kgalema Motlanthe, who was the then Deputy Vice President, who joined Dr. Taddy Blecher, and they conceptualized a program for changing education in South Africa. Dr. Blecher and his team visited countries internationally, harvested best practice, and in 2018, the blueprint on the right was presented to the National Department of Education. It was accepted unanimously, and we then entered in 2018 the pre-pilot phase, and we are currently in the pilot phase. But by 2030, we will have an institutionalized project-based learning in South African schools. If you look at the bus on this slide, the bus is crossing a bridge. On the left at the bottom, youth unemployment crisis. On the right, we need to cross that bridge so that the youth unemployment process is transformed into a body of youth who are meaningfully engaged and who have a place in society, who have a place in the economy. And the bus that's going to take these youth across the bridge is the EQ project and project-based learning. Because project-based learning, if you look at the top, unlocks 21st century competencies and solution-seeking mindsets, so that the youth become employable, engaged, and entrepreneurial. Those are the 3 E's in our E cubed: entrepreneurial, employable, and engaged in lifelong learning. And if this happens, we are certain that we will lower youth unemployment so that we achieve our compelling goal of reducing youth unemployment by 90% by 2030. And to achieve this, E cubed has embraced 3 groups of competencies that are part of the curriculum of the South African education system. Those 3 competencies are character building, connectivity and connection, and thinking. Because we believe that to face the world outside schools, youth need to be curious, resilient, they need to understand communication, they need to be empathetic, but they need to be thinkers. And they're ready. We are working with Generation Z. Not only are they tech savvy, but they demand respect, they're multitaskers, they care. This is a very beautiful quality about Generation Z. What they do should matter. It should be real life, it should be authentic. They love challenges, they're easily bored. What better way to satisfy them than through project-based learning? And then when we talk about project-based learning, I have an image from the Buck Institute. We're not talking about projects in the traditional sense where the teacher completed a chapter of the work and then a poster was produced, it was put up on the wall, and that was that. No, we are talking about a much more authentic and rigorous project-based learning, where an authentic project is introduced, and through research, learners develop the 21st century skills they need: problem solving, a growth mindset, real life skills, critical thinking, creative thinking, communication. They become goal-oriented. All these competencies are unlocked by project-based learning. And so this new body of learners, whom E-Cubes calling entrepreneurials are not only survivors, but they thrivers in the new normal. And project-based learning is a great vehicle for unlocking their preferred learning modes. And so we are really thrilled as E-Cubed and the Department of Basic Education to be associated with the Salesians and Professor Ryan, because they've agreed to test the new conceptual framework we're using for project-based learning in their school. And after rigorous and robust testing, we shall be implementing this model in the near future. And before I say goodbye, please just jot down the WhatsApp number 060-060-3333 onto your cell phone and connect with us via WhatsApp. We have our website address on the bottom of the screen, and my email address is ria@ecubed-dbe.org. Please join us and inquire about our program. We would love to have you. And I now hand over to Tom, who's going to be delving a little deeper into the theoretical framework which we are working with him towards. Thank you. Over to Tom.
Thank you, Ria. Hi, everyone, and I echo Ria's welcome, and I echo Father Pat's welcome to you all. 10,000 welcomes. And what's really exciting for us is the possibility of sharing what we see as an emerging, and it's still emerging, educational problem that can significantly deal with some of the many problems we face with our youth at the moment. Just following on from Father Pat, if we explore our task in a little bit more detail, at Learn to Live, we have a group of underdeveloped and underserved vulnerable youth who've in a sense been discarded by society in many ways. And given the uncertain future that they face, that Ria's painted, we are really concerned about how we actually prepare them. And given the current COVID-19 state and given the general level of unemployment of youth around us, if one looks at the expanded definition of unemployment, it appears though we're looking at about a 70% unemployment in our youth at the moment. And these are youth far more employable and far more qualified than the youth that we're working with. So what prospect is there for them? So at the Salesian Institute, in the spirit of Don Bosco, and also Paulo Ferreira, who's another recent educationalist who I think echoes the thoughts of Don Bosco, which Father covered, we ask the question, how might we help our learners learn to construct and live sustainable livelihoods? So we're thinking of it quite holistically. It's not just about knowledge and skills, it's the ability to construct and live sustainable livelihoods in this uncertain future that they face. So we've got this enormous chasm between where our learners are now and this future that they must face and build a sustainable livelihood in. One of the biggest problems is that our learners ask this question, why do I find it so hard to learn new things? Learning is hard for them. And the reason for this is that the psychosocial and the socioeconomic stresses that they've lived have significantly impacted on their ability to learn. So we're talking about how well can they learn? How much do they have to learn to be able to learn at the end of the day? And the aspects of this that we have to consider, and one of them is what we call the executive functions, which is a development aspect of young people. And the metaphor of an airport controller is a good example of what the executive functions are. That is the control center of the mind, which actually controls the actions and the responses that our learners take. And they're largely based on their working memory, their cognitive flexibility, and the degree which they can control their inhibitions. And in many of our learners, the executive functions are largely underdeveloped, which significantly hampers their ability to learn. The other one is their social emotional competence, their self-awareness and their self-management in social situations, their broad social awareness and their ability to build relationships and their general relationship skills, another area that they are underdeveloped in. And the third one is what I would call multiliteracy, is in this day of age and change that our learners face many different contexts, many different socio-cultural contexts, particularly given the high level of immigration, the changing technology and material world, the changing economic world, the ecological world they have to face. And within these worlds, there are multiple multimodal flows of communication and information, digital, audio, visual, spatial. They've got to cope with all this, and to be able to cope with this, they need a threshold level of literacy. And we're using literacy in the broadest sense of the word as the ability to make meaning in a situation. And we can think of these as a set of interacting variables from a learning and developmental system perspective. So if we look at executive functions, there are threshold levels that we need to achieve in order for them to start learning. Threshold levels of social emotional competence, threshold levels of multiliteracy. This essentially is the engine that propels learning. And for many of our learners, this engine has stalled, it has been disrupted. And our first real task is actually to kickstart this engine and get it going again. And much of what I'm going to talk to you about today is how we do this. And the way I've organized my talk is actually to look at 5 practices that underpin what we do in kickstarting this engine of learning. The first one is that we need to understand that much of our educational problems are a systems design problem. It's a system that in a sense is letting down our learners, and we have to seriously look at redesigning it. The second one is, in order to redesign, we need to have a conceptual framework of what it is we're doing, and we need to use these conceptual frameworks to guide us in our design and implementation processes. The third practice is actually to see learning as a co-management process. It's a process co-managed by the learner and the educator. And we use the work of Vygotsky, what's commonly known as a zone of proximal development, as a process for seeing learning as a co-managed process. A practice is also to see learning as a mediated process. It's not a process of straight transfer of information. It's a process that's mediated using certain tools and processes in doing that. And we actually see problem-based learning as the primary mediating process in learning. And finally, learning as a social process. And much of learning is about conversation, and how do we actually design and manage productive conversations that advance learning. Okay, let's look at our first practice. How do we understand this problem we're facing with our learners? If we look at our school results over the past decade or so, for every 100 learners starting school, 50 to 60 actually write matric, which is the leaving qualification. Of that, only 40 to 50 pass at the end of the day. And of that, only 6 get some form of undergraduate qualification within 6 years of passing the matriculation. What we have here is 2 education systems. At the top, we've got a highly developed education system with learners with high socioeconomic status, with high quality primary schools, high quality secondary schools, and this is a mechanism that works well for them and allows them to achieve high levels of education. At the bottom, we've got a flat grey dimensionless or unidimensional education system, under-resourced, attended by learners with low socioeconomic status, low quality primary schools, low quality secondary schools, and this works as a system that actually produces learners at what we would call the bottom of the education pyramid. Learners who don't get to matric, learners who don't pass matric. Look at the labour market. It actually mirrors a similar hierarchy, where at the top we've got high productivity, high income jobs. At the bottom we've got the unemployed, and somewhere in the middle we've got low productivity, low income jobs. This is where the bulk lies, 55% at this level, 10% at that level, and 35% at that level. What does this tell us? Firstly, is that learners at the bottom of the pyramid are actually locked in a vicious circle. They don't get the education qualifications, they're locked into low productivity jobs, low income jobs, many of them unemployed. The next generation is locked into that cycle with low socioeconomic status. They're forced to attend low education systems, and they get locked in this cycle going round and round and round. At the top end, we've got our learners who do well at school, get high levels of education, get high paying jobs, able to live high luxury lives with lots of resources, able to educate their children well, and their children then live in this elite cycle at the top. And this is well demonstrated by many statistical indicators where we have a bimodal distribution of these indicators rather than a normal distribution which would characterize a normal society. So what we're concerned about is what I would call emancipatory education in the spirit of Don Bosco and Paulo Freire. What we've got to do is educate our learners so that they can break out of this vicious cycle and actually build far more sustainable livelihoods for themselves. So that's the system we've got to redesign. How do we redesign that emancipatory education system? We need a conceptual framework of sorts, and the one we use is called the Cultural Historical Activity Framework, which again has its roots in Vygotsky's work. And essentially, we're looking at it at a classroom level. It's a model we can use at multiple levels, where we have a teacher who's managing a learning process, and note I say managing rather than driving it, and we're getting learning in order to achieve some sort of learning outcomes, and using a set of tools and processes and artifacts which helps the teacher mediate that process. The second thing to realize is that this teacher doesn't operate in a vacuum. They operate in a context where there are certain rules that she has to conform to. There's a community within which she works, and the community itself has different roles in actually bringing about this learning process. So we have to understand the teaching process and the context in which the teaching process happens. I'm just going to focus on the classroom level and focus on the learning, on our practices on relating to the learning and process and the learning outcomes and the artifacts for mediating learning processes. So next I'm going to look at these learning processes in a bit more detail. So we would argue that an authentic learning process is a co-managed process between the learner and the educator. And I'm going to use Vygotsky's zone of proximal development to demonstrate this. So looking at our learners, we would imagine a learner coming here asking the question, how might we, you and me, me and you, the educator, work together to help me learn better? And if we look at Vygotsky's model, if one looks at increasing competence and increasing level of challenge of the learning, there are three zones. Where there's very low challenge, the learners become bored and disengaged. When the challenge is too high, they become anxious and confused. So what we've got to do in managing the learning process is actually keep the learner in what Vygotsky called the zone of proximal development, in which optimal learning actually happens. So we've got to manage a learning process that keeps the learner within that zone. How do we do that? First thing that's important is to realize that learning has to be visible so that both the learner and the educator can observe it. And in the program that we've designed, we use the habits of mind, thinking maps, and e-portfolios as mechanisms for making learning visible. And really what we're looking for is acquired knowledge, levels of understanding, and the transfer of learning. This is largely based on what we call the understanding by design framework. In managing the learning process, we need to be clear about what our goals are, and the gaps between what the actual learning is and the goals are very important. We need to monitor those and understand those. So if we look at the development of our learning practices based on the gaps between the actual learning and the actual goals that we want, we've got to look at how the learners might change their learning practices in association with the educator. And also the educator has to be aware of those gaps and understand what the impact of their, in inverted commas, teaching is on the learner, and view the results in terms of visible learning. And then interact in a way that scaffolds the learning process. And again, we use what's generally known as the gradual release of responsibility model. We look at the process of nudging the learner along, and largely driven by sort of Socratic questioning. And then the other important thing is formative assessment, that we continually have a formative assessment process going, which makes both the learner and the educator aware of the learner's progress. So what is the zone of proximal development? It's a notional space for optimal learning. And this space is co-created and co-produced interdependently between the learner and the educator. And if we go back to Bosco and Don Bosco and Paulo Freire, they would refer to this as the pedagogy of love, this interdependent actions between both the learner and the educator. Coupled to the learning process is what the learning process has to have certain learning outcomes. And we think of outcomes as the ability of our learners to function. And this is largely based on a much sense concept of the capability approach. So if you look at our learners, the first thing that's important is that they need to learn to manage their own well-being. And that has to be managed in the social situation they find themselves, their families, their communities, society. And Father Pat has pointed out what these might look like. They've got to manage their personal well-being in a material world, the technological world that's changing rapidly, and Ria's pointed much of that out. And they've also got to manage their personal well-being in an economic world. And of course, with climate change, they have to manage it within a natural world. So our learners might ask us is, how might you help me learn to function more productively? So how do we function more productively in this world? And using Sen's concept of functionings, which is about beings and doings within this world, functionings are underpinned by a set of capabilities. Capabilities by themselves aren't enough. They have to be put to work in some form of functioning for them to add value. And these these capabilities are molded by some knowledge and skills at the end of the day. So that's essentially the process leading to the outcomes we're looking for, which are the ability of our learners to function in this new world they're going to find themselves. But our problem still exists. The engine propelling the learners of our learning has stalled, has been disrupted, and how are we going to kickstart it again? We essentially use the habits of mind framework for doing this, and I'll touch on that briefly in another slide. And the development of the habits of mind are mediated by thinking maps, and I'll touch on that as well. So a habit of mind is a disposition to behaving intelligently. And the key point here is that intelligent behavior can be learned. It's not a trait. And what we want is intelligent behavior when a learner is confronted with problems, something that is not immediately known and understood. And the learner essentially has to ask, what ought I do in this situation? Now, there's 16 basic habits of mind. I'll just go through them quickly. Persisting, finding humor, gathering data, creating, imagining, innovating, thinking, communicating with clarity and precision, responding with wonderment, thinking about thinking, taking responsible risks, striving for accuracy, questioning and posing problems. But the foundation habits of mind that will actually kickstart our engine of learning are thinking flexibly, managing impulsivity, applying knowledge, past knowledge to new situations, listening and understanding with empathy, and thinking interdependently. So these are the foundation habits of mind that we look to develop. And once we've got these in place, we'll start looking at the others. And the development of these habits of mind are actually mediated through a process of constructing thinking maps, and we'll talk more about that as we go along. And thinking maps are essentially 8 visual processes, mapping processes that reflect 8 specific thought processes. And what it does, it helps our learners visualize their thinking and document their abstract thoughts. I'm just going to run through them quickly. A circle map defines the context in which they find themselves. A tree map classifies. A multi-flow map explores cause and effect. A bubble map describes the qualities of an object. A flow map sequencing. A bridge map looks for analogies. A double bubble map compares and contrasts. And a brace map looks at whole part relationships. Now, our learner would ask here is, what is a good way to think about this? Should I explore a possibility of defining the context, classifying the definitions and exploring cause and effect? Or shall I use a bubble map to describe the qualities and then look at a sequence? Or shall I compare and contrast two objects and then look for analogies? Or compare and contrast and look at a part-whole relationship? So these are the thinking maps that they use that mediate the development of the habits of mind that I was actually talking about. So that's practice 3, is actually seeing learning as a co-managed process in developing habits of mind and using thinking maps to mediate the development process. The 4th practice is about seeing learning as a mediated process, and we see problem-based learning as a mediating process. So problem-based learning is not an end in itself. It's a tool used to facilitate and mediate the development process and the learning processes of our learners. We've developed a particular model of project-based learning, which starts off with inquiry-based learning, then moves on to problem-based learning, and then moves on to design-based learning. So if we look at the process, moving from inquiry-based learning, in inquiry-based learning, the learner develops a body of conceptual and procedural knowledge. Now, the learner may choose, or the teacher may choose to exit the project there, so that they'd exit with a critical mass of conceptual and procedural knowledge, or they may go on to apply that knowledge in a problem situation to understand a context and understand a problem. And then once they've done that, they may exit the process having applied that conceptual and procedural knowledge to a particular context, or they may go on into design-based learning where they actually produce a physical prototype which will actually solve the problem that they explore in the problem-based learning. So this is a really flexible process which you can exit given a set of circumstances, or you can continue all the way through. And at the school, we have 3 learning spaces in which this happens. We have what we call the STEM space, which is the classical science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, in which inquiry learning and the beginning of problem-based learning is actually realized. Then we have a maker space in which this artifact is designed and built. And then we have a mad space, which is maybe new to many of you involved in project-based learning. That's music, art, dance and drama, in which our learners take this physical object that they've produced and express it and communicate it in some artistic or aesthetic way to express their understanding of this particular artifact and how it will solve the problem. So let's look at a typical week at Learn to Live. We have a 5-day week. Besides the project-based learning, the learners still do their skills training and skills development, and Gabriel will talk more about those. So they'd start off with a day in the STEM space, then move on to spending a day in the maker space, and then spending a day in the mad space. Now, we don't have subjects in the classical sense of the word because we do integrated projects. So what we do is we focus our projects on this world in which our learners are expected to learn to function. So we focus on projects about developing personal well-being, projects about understanding how to work in the social world, how to function in the material world, how to function in the economic world, and how to function in the natural world. So let's look at an example. Project-based learning starts with a question. So if you look at our learner, and the learner might ask the question, how might we better manage our oral health, which is a very real problem in their lives. So what we're doing is, we're focusing on a project about personal well-being, which does interface with the social world. A project like that would look at something like that. So we'd set up a project of how might we promote oral health in the school. In the STEM space, they'll develop critical oral health literacies. They would then decide that they would actually promote oral health in the school by designing a brochure and distributing a brochure. So in the makerspace, they will design and produce a brochure for promoting oral health in the school. And then in the MAD space, they'll design and perform an event that would launch the program for promoting oral health within the school. So next, let's drill down on what might happen in the STEM space in a bit more detail. Our learner starts with the question is, how might we better understand our oral health? And I draw quite heavily on the work of people around experiential learning, and particularly Cope and Kalantzis. So this is their multi-literacy pedagogy model, which starts off with some sort of experience, conceptualizing what was experienced, analyzing it in some detail, and then applying it back in practice. And when designing a learning experience, we also need to take into account which habits of mind we're going to focus on. So typically we would always focus on our foundation habits, which is thinking flexibly, applying past knowledge to new situations, and managing impulsivity. In the experience phase, the learners would experience what they know, so they draw upon their prior knowledge. So the teacher here essentially models the process and questions, activates prior knowledge, and gets the learners to reflect. So what is it they already know about oral health? And then they'd also then explore new information about oral health. It could be a presentation by an expert, a medical person, or it could be a series of videos. And what they'll do is they'll capture the insights they've gained from the discussion of the known, their prior knowledge, and from the new, they'd capture it in what we would call a circle map, which defines the context. So in the circle map, they've captured all of these insights. They then move into the conceptualizing stage. And we conceptualize by naming. This essentially means taking these insights and categorizing them or classifying them into categories. And the tree map is a very powerful thinking map for doing that. So what they do is all these insights, they put them into a set of categories, and then they'd name those categories. They would then use some theory to help them make better sense. And the cause and effect or multi-flow diagram is very useful for looking at the causes and effects of managing oral health. So at this stage, what they've done is they've gathered all this information from their experiences, they've classified it, and they've built a basic cause and effect model of oral health. Then in the analyzing phase, they'd say, okay, we've got this cause and effect model. How would it functionally work in practice? And they'd explore it in some detail and then build what we would call a flow map, which would sequence a series of steps in how you might go about managing your oral health. They then also analyze it critically, and what we mean by that is seeing it from different perspectives. How would a learner experience this process of managing their health? How would a parent, how would a teacher? And essentially this is a collaborative task. Questioning, clarifying, discussing, reflecting. And we might decide to actually introduce another habit there, which is thinking independently, because it's a collaborative task. And once they've got a sense of how this would work in practice and how the different actors might see it through a double bubble map, they would then start applying it. How would we apply this in practice? They would apply it. How would we go about actually practicing oral health? What are the detailed steps, the practical steps we would take? And they may actually look at some creativity in there by using a bridge map and seeing analogies, comparing managing oral health to other health management practices. Again, it's a collaborative task and focusing on the ability to think interdependently. So when we end the inquiry-based project, we've actually produced a set of thinking maps that in fact has answered the learner's question of how we might better understand our oral health. And then the last practice is about understanding that much of learning is social and much of it is about conversation. So our learner might ask us, how can we actually talk amongst each other more productively that would lead to more learning? Working in the STEM lab is about doing and thinking. And then once we start thinking about things, we can start speaking about them and listening to what other people have to say about it. So the listening and speaking is a very strong reinforcing process that reinforces the doing and thinking, and the doing and thinking then reinforces the listening and speaking processes that happen in these labs. And then we get, from a literacy point of view, we have to start reading and writing about what we're speaking about. So once we can speak about something, we can start writing about something. And once we start writing about something, we can start reading about it. And again, the listening and speaking, the talk process, is a strong driver of the reading and writing process. And if we look at modern literacy, sees talk as the foundation of literacy. James Britton, a writer in the field of literacy, argues that reading and writing float in a sea of talk. And this highlights the importance of listening and speaking. The term oracy has been invented for talk that is at the foundation of literacy. But we need to have some framework for managing this listening and talking. And the framework we've developed for what we might argue is a productive conversation. You initially have to frame what the talk is about, then engage each other through a process of advocacy and inquiry, and in the process make sure that we illustrate the points we're making through concrete examples. And this is a way of managing the talk processes within these various learning spaces. And using this model now, I just want to have a look at what a typical school day would look like at Learn to Live. The first 3 hours of the day, and we're talking about a 6-hour school day, is about the content session. This would happen in the STEM space or the maker space or the MAD space. And what happens is they construct a series of thinking maps in that process. They then move into a language session, which is 2 hours. We teach essentially 3 languages, English, Xhosa, and Afrikaans. And what we do here is we verbalize these thinking maps. And we follow a particular process called the language experience approach, which is mediated again by the gradual release of responsibility model. And in the process, we construct sentences from the maps. And then what we do is we adapt and organize these sentences into a piece of writing. And what we're doing here is we're thinking and speaking and writing about oral health in the oral health project. So they'll be thinking and speaking and writing about whatever the topic of the project-based learning process is. The key thing here is that we have a centralized theme through the whole week. In this particular example, it's on oral health, and all the learning is focused on oral health, and that's the vehicle for developing knowledge and literacy as we go along. Then at the end of the day, each learner then takes an hour to themselves in which they reflect on what it is they've learned, identify 3 important lessons, which they then enter into an e-portfolio. And that, in a sense, gives you a sense of what a day may look like. So this, as you may have thought along the way, is all very well in theory. How does it happen in practice? And Gabriel, who's the project manager on the ground at Learn to Live, is going to give you some examples of how this happens in practice. Thank you, Gabriel. You can take over now. Thank you.
My name is Hamuy.
Okay, Samir, so how are you enjoying this new way of how the teachers are teaching you?
Okay, I think it's actually great because why? Like, we get more out of the work that we used to do, and like, it's always like more, how can I say? It like, it brings out more stuff than what you actually would have if you had like normal lessons. You see, and it makes it like better for us because it's nice and easy also.
Is it more, are you more active? Are you more concentrating? Are you more involved?
Yes, it helps a lot with all of those because first then we didn't do much interacting with each other. Now it's coming better and the presentations and all that is just coming together.
So you're really enjoying it?
Yes, I love it.
Okay.
My name is
Thank you very much, Tom, for that. As Tom said, I'm Gabriel and I'm the project manager on PBL. I would like to just take you through what a typical day looks like for a learner at the Learn to Live School of Skill. And Tom touched on the makerspace and the STEM day. And so I'd like to touch on is the MAD day, the music, arts, drama and dance day. And as Tom was explaining the 5 points that we're concentrating on, I'm going to be touching on the last 3 and how this is practically put into practice within the day. So this is what a typical week looks like in the School of Skills. Tom already went over that. So what I'm going to say, it's like the lesson plan. The learners come in, and as we said, the first 3 hours are spent using the thinking maps and using flow maps to put together what they're going to be doing later on in the day. And this part is where the co-managed process begins, where the learners and the teachers come together and the learning happens. The teachers start very briefly with what they have to do and the learner takes over. And what we're doing there is the teachers are moving from being the sage on the stage and more to the guide on the side. And learners are then able to learn in their own way. From there, once they've been given the brief, they will start using their thinking maps and the storyboards, and this will actually bring the learning to life. The thinking is made visual, and the learners are able to see where they're going and what they need to do. And this is what Tom means by the mediated process. You can see our learners doing their maps and putting up their flowcharts on the board there. From there, if we take, for example, the oral health program that we were discussing, they will need to launch a program for oral health where they need to emphasize their personal importance and the importance for the public on what oral health is. And how do they do this? They take some sort of artistic endeavor that's performed either through a play, video installation, which is all coming through from the information they've received throughout the week in the other 2 days and what they've planned within their thinking maps. So that is more or less the doing part. And after that, we'll move on to the language section where the learners think and the social learning starts to happen. The learners put together what they've done in the day. They write down their thoughts, their feelings, and what has actually been learned. And the teacher can then from there take and scaffold whether they need to add on any gaps that have been missing by the learner. And this is where the learner is given their voice. And they themselves tell them what they've learned. And after that, we will finish off with the language experience approach, where they themselves put their portfolio of evidence together. And that is what they use to get marked on, to get assessed on, and also to take home with them. And the learning continues from that thought process. So it's an ongoing continuous learning process throughout the day. Now, PBL is one part of the learning process for the learners that learn to live. As we mentioned before, also, we do offer skills because we want to make them employable learners. We have 4 workshops that the learners may choose to use, and they go on for the 4 years that they attend the school. We've got the electrical, the woodwork, the hairdressing, and the hospitality. Now, through the skill that they learned, they will go out into the real world, build up a portfolio of evidence on what they're able to do in the skill set that they've chosen. And by following a curriculum which is nationally accredited by the Education Department, they are able to use that and go out into the real world and present to potential employers what they are able to do. So what we are aiming to do is put together a holistic learner that will be able to have a sustainable livelihood. And we will use the 3 points on EQ, where entrepreneurship is taught through PBL and life skills, employment through the workshops, and lifelong learning through our PBL. And this is something that they might be able to take together, take the skill set, put it into content, and go out there, and whatever they choose to do, they will be able to cope with it. Now, the last part that I want to speak about is the learning has to take place in a safe environment. A lot of our learners come from various socioeconomic circumstances, and a lot of experience very big hardships. So what we try to do is remove some of these socioeconomic stresses. How do we do that? One, we give them 3 meals a day. A happy learner can keep concentrated on learning instead of worrying about food. Their mental health. We take care of their mental health by having a social worker. They can go to her. They do group work. We have our occupational therapists who also do a lot of cognitive exercises with them and discuss any of their personal hardships, therefore taking care of their mental health. The other 2 points that we also help them out on is in the transport costs. And this allows the learner to have no excuses to attend school, and any learning materials are provided for them. Above all, we try and create a very healthy and safe environment through our child safety policy for all learners. Now, once we put all that together, we aim to have a holistically well-developed person that can go out into the job market and find jobs and adapt to what they're able to do in their lives. To bring it all together, this has been a learning process. So for any schools out there, teachers who would like to implement this, I'd like to share 1 or 2 challenges we faced. The first one is timetabling. We've had to do an entire redo of our timetable, and I want you to just take that into consideration. Timetabling PBL is not the same as timetabling a normal school timetable, and integrating this is a challenge. Teachers training. Teachers went from being a classic subject teacher to being a cross-curricular teacher now, and this took a lot of shifting. There was training provided for them, we have workshops, and there's ongoing support for them at all times, which in turn leads to the next point. Our teachers have had to become curriculum architects, where they are now putting together all their subjects. They've had to collaborate with each other in order to put together PBL projects that encompass the current curriculum which they have to disseminate to learners throughout the year. This has come at a great effort from our teachers, and I must say our teachers have really stepped up to the game for this. And resources. A lot of these PBL projects we do require specific equipment, and they're not always disposable to us, but we make do with what we have. And as we like to say, developing's ability to function is not about the resources you have. What it actually does, it gives our learners an opportunity to improvise and innovate. And in this case, they're learning a real life challenge. What happens when I don't have what I can do? I improvise, I make do, and I make things happen. So it's not really a challenge, but a welcomed learning process. And to wrap it up, I'd like to share a few observations that have happened since we've installed the PBL within the school. One thing, and the main thing, is learners are finding their voice. This is something very big for us. Learners who before wouldn't speak, who wouldn't integrate themselves with other learners, are now happy to come through, to present their findings, to do the plays, to take part in things. And they actually have said to us, "Sir, ma'am, this way of teaching is giving me a voice. I am so happy that I am being heard." That in itself is a huge achievement. And with that, confidence has increased within learners. They are really happy to come up, present, interact, share their stories, and in that way, learning is continuously happening. Teachers cannot believe the change in the learners. And to finally wrap it up, what that has done is it has upped our attendance. Learners have a new zest for learning. They want to come to school. They're constantly asking, what are we going to learn this week? What are we going to do? What sort of experiment? And that capturing that inquisitiveness is bringing them to school. They do not want to miss out on anything that we're doing at the school. That's some of the observations we're seeing. I hope you've enjoyed our presentation. And if you have any questions, please email them to info@salesianyouth.org. We're going to take one question now. We have a question from, it's an anonymous question, but they're asking if we use software to do our maps, or is it paper-based? So as it stands, the learners are starting to do some IT skills, but we're not quite there yet. So for now, paper is being used, but gradually we should move up where they do the portfolio of evidence and their maps in an electronic digital manner. If there are any other questions, please feel free to send us an email and we will get back to you. I thank you very much for your time, and I'm going to now pass over to Father Pat to take us off.
Guramila Mahagi. In Gaelic again, it means thanks 1,000 times for listening to our little presentation from the southern tip of Africa. Thank you very much. Yes, we're starting small, but I promise you, we're thinking big. And we're definitely thinking for the youth and for their future. And what we presented, I really hope, will apply to all schools in time. Slán thank you very, very much. And thank you to all our supporters who's helped us to make this presentation possible and help us especially to do something for the youth. Slán